She was everywhere in the late 1970s, on magazine covers, on television screens, smiling with a softness America instantly trusted. Dorothy Stratten was hailed as the perfect fantasy, the girl next door, elevated into a national dream almost overnight. Fame embraced her fast, almost violently, but while the world saw glamour, behind the camera flashes, behind the carefully posed photographs, something darker was taking shape. Slow, controlling, and unseen. What really happened behind that smile? Was this just the price of sudden fame, or the warning signs of a tragedy no one wanted to see? Dorothy's story did not begin under bright lights or velvet ropes. She was born into an ordinary family far removed from the world that would later claim her image, and ultimately her life raised in a working-class household after her family moved from Canada to the United States. Dorothy grew up quiet, polite, and eager to please. She was not the type who demanded attention. In fact, those who knew her early on often described her as gentle, almost fragile in her need to be accepted. At school, she blended in more than she stood out. She was attractive, yes, but not yet extraordinary. What defined her most was her compliance. Dorothy learned early that harmony mattered, that keeping others happy often meant silencing her own discomfort. This instinct would later shape nearly every decision she made. Long after childhood had ended, her teenage years were marked by routine rather than rebellion. She worked modest jobs, dreamed small dreams, and seemed content with stability. No calculated plan to conquer Hollywood. Fame did not call to her, it found her. When the opportunity came, it arrived disguised as admiration and encouragement. Someone saw potential in her face, her innocence, her natural warmth. To Dorothy, it felt less like exploitation and more like validation, proof that she mattered, that she was special enough to be chosen. But that early need for approval came with a hidden cost. The same traits that made Dorothy approachable, lovable, and camera-ready also made her vulnerable. She trusted easily, she deferred often, and she struggled to recognize the line between guidance and control. How could someone so ordinary be thrust into such an extraordinary world? And once she stepped into it, was she ever truly free to step back out? Dorothy's rise was not gradual, it was explosive. What began as a single photo shoot quickly became something far larger than anyone, especially Dorothy herself, could have anticipated in an era when beauty was often manufactured. She didn't project seduction, she embodied approachability. That combination proved irresistible to an industry always searching for a new fantasy. Almost overnight, Dorothy went from an unknown young woman to one of the most visible faces in American pop culture. Playboy did not just feature her. They elevated her within a remarkably short span of time. She was no longer simply a model. She became a symbol, a promise, the embodiment of innocence wrapped in glamour. The media labeled her the girl next door. But this was not the quiet neighbor from childhood memories. Dee was a carefully framed ideal, polished and broadcast to millions. Inside the Playboy world, Dorothy was treated as a revelation. She was praised not only for her looks, but for her demeanor. She was polite, corrective. She did what was asked without complaint, without resistance. In an industry that often clashed with strong personalities, her softness was interpreted as professionalism. Yet that same softness came at a price as her image circulated across magazines and television screens. Dorothy's sense of self began to blur. The public persona grew louder, brighter, more demanding, while the private Dorothy struggled to keep pace. Those close to her later recalled how surreal it all felt. One moment she was learning lines and attending small events. The next she was being ushered into rooms filled with executives, photographers, and powerful men who all believed they knew who she was. Hollywood soon followed. Casting offers arrived quickly, almost impatiently. Dorothy was no longer just a model crossing into acting. She was being positioned as a legitimate star in the making. Film and television producers saw something marketable. Beauty without arrogance, charm without defiance. She was easy to saw to prove she belonged. She took direction seriously, studied her roles, and avoided controversy. She wanted to be respected, not merely admired. But respect in Hollywood often comes with conditions, and for Dorothy, those conditions were rarely explained out loud. Behind the scenes, her schedule tightened. Her appearance became a subject of constant scrutiny. Every pound, every angle, decisions about her career were increasingly made for her. Not with her. What seemed like guidance slowly began to resemble orchestration. The contrast was stark in photographs. Dorothy appeared radiant, perfectly composed, but in candid moments, rare behind-the-scenes images told a quieter story. Away from the lights, her posture softened. Her expressions grew uncertain. There was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she were still asking permission to exist in this new world. Fame did not empower her in the way many expected. It isolated her. The more visible she became, the fewer people she could trust. Conversations were filtered. Relations were evaluated for usefulness. Even compliments carried expectation. Dorothy learned quickly that admiration in the entertainment industry was rarely unconditional. Still, she pushed forward. She believed success would bring stability, that if she worked hard enough, complied long enough, everything would eventually settle. That the chaos of sudden fame was temporary. That control would return once she proved herself indispensable. But the industry had already begun to take ownership of her image. She was photographed constantly, yet rarely seen as a whole person. Interviews focused on her looks rather than her thoughts. Articles praised her beauty, but glossed over her voice. Each feature reinforced a version of Dorothy that the public adored, but one that left little room for growth or autonomy. And as her career accelerated, another tension quietly intensified alongside it. The boundaries between professional guidance and personal control began to erode. Decisions about her roles, her public appearances, even her daily movements were increasingly influenced by forces beyond her comfort. What was once framed as protection began to feel like restriction. Was this simply the price of success, or was Dorothy losing ownership of her life faster than she was gaining fame? By the time the world had fully embraced her as America's newest dream girl, Dorothy stood at a crossroads she didn't yet recognize. One path promised even greater stardom, but demanded obedience. The other hinted at independence, but risked everything she had built. She was rising higher than she ever imagined. But beneath the ascent, pressure was building. And soon that pressure would no longer remain hidden. At the center of Dorothy's private life was a relationship that had begun long before fame, but transformed as her visibility grew. What once appeared to be support slowly evolved into surveillance, admiration hardened into possession, and love once spoken gently began to arrive with conditions. Her marriage was often described from the outside as protective. Those closest to her were told she was being looked after, that her career was being managed responsibly. But protection has a subtle twin, control, and the line between the two grew thinner with every passing month. As Dorothy's star rose, jealousy crept in quietly. Success brought attention, attention brought independence, and independence threatened the fragile balance of power at home. Her career no longer revolved around one person's approval. She was meeting producers, actors, executives, people who spoke to her as a professional, not a possession. That shift did not go unnoticed. Phone calls were monitored, movements questioned, finances scrutinized. What Dorothy earned, where she went, and who she spoke to increasingly required justice. Small tensions layered over time until normalcy itself felt like walking on glass. Still, Dorothy tried to keep the peace. She avoided confrontation. She reassured, she apologized even when she wasn't sure why. Years of learning to please others had taught her that harmony mattered more than asserting herself. And for a while, that strategy seemed to work. Publicly, nothing appeared wrong. Professionally, she continued to shine. Privately, she was shrinking. Friends later recalled subtle changes. Her voice lowered. Her laughter faded quicker. She hesitated before making simple decisions. The confidence followed her home. Then came the turning point. Dorothy began to envision a future shaped by her own choices. She spoke of independence, of stepping away from suffocating dynamics, of reclaiming control, not just over her career, but over her life. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine freedom without permission. That possibility proved dangerous. What happened next unfolded behind closed doors, far from cameras and public admiration. The details are harrowing, and the outcome irreversible. In a moment of violence that stunned the nation, Dorothy's life was taken, along with the future she had only just begun to claim. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines exploded, shock rippled through Hollywood. Fans struggled to reconcile the smiling face they adored with the brutality of her final moments. How could someone so celebrated be so unprotected? How could warning signs exist in plain sight, yet remain unaddressed? Could it have ended differently? were ignored. Dorothy's death forced an uncomfortable reckoning. It exposed how easily control can masquerade as care, how fame can amplify vulnerability rather than erase it, and how silence, whether out of fear, politeness, or denial, can become deadly. Her story was no longer just about beauty or success. It became a cautionary tale, etched permanently into the cultural memory of an industry that had adored her, but failed to truly see her. Dorothy never lived to experience life after fame. There was no quiet reinvention, no reflective interviews, no chance to redefine herself beyond the image the world had frozen in time. Instead, her story ended abruptly, leaving others to interpret its meaning in her absence. In the years that followed, Dorothy Stratten became more than a former Playboy icon. She became a symbol zoom that unsettled the entertainment industry and the public alike. Her death forced a rare pause, a moment of collective discomfort that challenged long-held assumptions about glamour, protection, and power. For many, her image remained hauntingly unchanged. Youthful, radiant, forever smiling, what once looked like effortless success was re-examined through a darker lens. The speed of her rise, the imbalance of control in her private life, the warning signs that in hindsight felt impossible to ignore. Hollywood moved on as it always does. New faces replaced old ones. But Dorothy's story lingered, resurfacing in documentaries, articles, and conversations about the hidden dangers faced by women whose visibility outpaces their autonomy. She became a reference point, a reminder that fame does not equal safety, and admiration does not guarantee respect for younger generations. Dorothy's legacy took on a different tone. She was no longer just a pin-up or a headline from the past. She represented a cautionary truth about consent, control, and the cost of silence. Her life became part of a broader dialogue about agency, about who gets to decide the direction of a woman's career, body, and future. Perhaps the most painful aspect of her legacy is its incompleteness. Dorothy was just beginning to understand her own worth beyond the roles assigned to her. She was on the verge of reclaiming her voice, off stepping into adulthood on her own terms. That possibility was taken from her. Yet in its absence, something remained. A story powerful enough to continue asking uncomfortable questions long after the applause faded. And in remembering Dorothy not just as a fantasy, but as a human being, her legacy endures, not as a warning alone, but as a call for awareness, empathy. Dorothy Stratten's story is not simply a tale of beauty or broken dreams. It is a reminder of how easily admiration can obscure reality, and how quickly control can disguise itself as care. She rose faster than almost anyone of her era, embraced by a culture that celebrated her image. Behind the headlines and photographs was a young woman learning, slowly and painfully, what it meant to claim her own life. By the time she began to understand her worth beyond what others projected onto her, time had already run out. Dorothy was not just a symbol. She was a person, gentle, hopeful, and human. Remembering her only as a tragic figure does her a disservice. Remembering her as someone whose voice was never fully heard offers a deeper lesson. Her life asks us to look more closely at the stories we consume, to question who holds power behind the scenes, and to recognize the warning signs we often choose to ignore. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect and to share. Subscribe for more untold stories of classic icons whose lives were far more complex than their public images suggest. Leave a comment below. What do you think was the real cost of Dorothy Stratten's fame? Because behind every dream girl there is a real human story waiting to be seen.